I'll go ahead and let our waiters. And if that sounds good.
Yep.
Okay.
Good morning, everyone. We're going to give it just a couple more minutes. Thank you for being on time. We'll give it till about 9:05 before we officially start. Okay, it is now 9:05. I am Catherine. I am the community engagement strategist with CultureWorks, and we also have Piper, who is our marketing and communications specialist. We will be hosting the Zoom. Our guest speaker this month is Marlene Paul. She is the founder and director of Art 180. And we also have with us Scott Garca, who is CultureWorks president. Scott, would you like to say a few words about CultureWorks and our organization?
Sure. Thanks, Catherine. Good morning, everyone. Great to see everyone here this morning. I just like to give a brief update since we always have some new faces on these morning coffees. Just to let you know that CultureWorks, we are a nonprofit. Our mission is to strengthen artists and arts and culture organizations to drive a greater impact in the community. We talk about when I talk about impact, it's about economic impact, education impact, and building a stronger community. So Catherine has put together this wonderful series where other leaders in our community are sharing their experiences and their stories. And so thrilled to hear from Marlene this morning. One more thing before I go, just a quick plug for October VA. If you haven't yet, make sure you get your events on the calendar. You can post those events for free at the at our arts and culture calendar. And maybe Piper can post a link to that in the chat during the conversation. Excited about October VA. It's going to be huge. I know that the momentum is growing, so looking forward to that. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Catherine.
Thank you. And with October VA, we're introducing weekly spotlight events. This year, we're kicking off with the concert with Weldon Hill at the Valentine the first week. Tickets are on sale. You can find those links on our social media, on our website. They're through Eventbrite. So we hope that you join us for one of our spotlight events. So I'm going to introduce Marlene. She's going to do more of a conversational style presentation. So I'll leave it up to her whether or not she wants to take questions during or after her speech. And you can either put those in the chat or raise your hand on the screen so she can see you. Like all of us, Marlene was born an artist, and like many of us, she didn't remain one. The Richmond native's formal education began at Crestview Elementary, the site of one of Art 180's very first projects, I Am. She graduated long ago from James Madison University, where she studied art until she remembered she was better at writing and switched to communications journalism. After a decade of roles in writing, editing, PR, and advertising, she met a friend who shared her belief that art is a form of communication. In 1998, they co-founded Art 180 to cultivate creative expression in young people. And she still directs the now 25-year-old organization. She lives near the mighty James River with her teenage daughter, hound dog, and tuxedo cat, and she recently returned to being an artist. So we'd like to welcome Marlene Paul to present on organizational diversity.
Okay, thank you, Catherine. And thank you, Scott. Can everybody hear me okay? Can you hear me clear my throat? Sorry. All right, welcome. Smallish group. We could have done this in my living room like we did in the early days. That would have been fun. And this is a coffee. So does everybody have your coffee? It's the only thing about these Zoom meetings is no more free coffee. You gotta brew your own, and mine's too hot to drink right now. So hopefully I can drink that. So a couple disclaimers before I start. One is that my hound dog that you heard about hates the mailman. So should the mailman come while we're on this call, you might hear him. He's in the other room, so hopefully you won't, but I apologize in advance if that happens. And then the other disclaimer is that I am not an expert in any of this, and I'm a practitioner, and I'm learning as I go, as hopefully we all are. So I ask for your graciousness in understanding that too. And when Catherine and I met about a year ago, just getting to know each other when she was new in her role, I was telling her about some of the things we were doing at Art 180 in diversity and education and equity. And so several months later, she emailed me and said, would I do this talk? And my first thought was, I don't remember what I said because it was a casual conversation. And my other thought was, I don't have 30 minutes worth of stuff to talk about. But as I started to just make some notes, I realized I have a lot more than that to talk about. So I'm going to move through it kind of quickly and don't want to talk at you for too long. And also give time for others to share, because I'm really sharing my experience. And as one of my favorite poet philosophers, Mark Nepo, said on a YouTube video I watched recently, that he was sharing examples and not instructions. So I hope you will receive them that way. And I know you have examples too, and we're really learning from each other. So maybe at the end, if you have questions, I'm happy to take those, but I'm also hoping folks will share their own examples of things that they've tried in this area. And I really think that the important thing with DEI work is being open to learning. And that's what we're doing, and being intentional about that, and being willing to try and to screw up, because that's inevitable. And sometimes that's where the greatest learning comes in. And one of the places that I did not screw up is in hiring Nicole Jones as our deputy director. And Nicole's actually here today. I noticed she was the first one Zooming in. So I think she's really curious to see what I have to say, and may have something to add herself. But so you have bonus material today, and she'll be featured throughout my talk. And she's really been a teacher and a co-learner with me in this process. So I don't have a bunch of slides for you, but I do want to share a couple of photos and kind of a then and now. So I'm going to share my screen briefly and pull up this image. There we go. Okay, so I'm actually the co-founder, and as Catherine read in my bio, I started Art 180 with a friend in 1998, and this is us here in 2001. So this is about 3 years in, and we're at Fulton Hill Studios. This is where our first office was. We were there for 5 years, and this photo is from there was a cover story in Style Weekly about Art 180, and interestingly, an article came out yesterday in Style Weekly, which is now online, about the work we've been doing with our summer residency program. So if you want to learn more about what we're doing programmatically, I encourage you to check that out. But in this photo, Kathleen is about 6 months pregnant, and she's preparing to move home to Oregon to start her family, which she did soon after. And then I'll show you another photo. I'm going to fast forward to now. And this was from this summer. This is from May. And this is also at Fulton Hill Studios. And we were celebrating the return of Maurice, who's here in this patterned shirt. He's our program director, and he lives in Berlin now, and he works kind of a hybrid model. So he was home for the summer. And so we were reconnecting with Mo, and we were also celebrating our 25th anniversary in the month that we were really getting started in 98. And so I thought it would be great to take the team back to where it all started. And this is Blue Atlas, which is a restaurant that's at Fulton Hill Studios. And most of our folks had never been there before to Fulton Hill. So it felt good to just kind of anchor in this place. So you'll see that the staff looks different. It's bigger. A lot more diversity. And we've actually changed since this was taken in May. So Vaughn Garland, who's next to Mo on the right, he left in June, and he was replaced by Dallas Roquemore, who's a Black man. He actually looks surprisingly similar to Mo. I say he's Mo in another font. And then we also just last week added a position, a development and operations coordinator, and hired Jade Dickinson. So we have an 8th person. And then this doesn't include our intern. We have a long-term intern, U of Urbana scholar, Alexis Rogers, who's Black. And so she's a part-time part of our team. So that's Art 180 kind of then and now. Turn this off. I can. And I thought it was interesting that the first photo was black and white, and the other one was color, kind of like we're more colorful now. So obviously, when we were starting, we were two white women. And as Catherine referenced, we had these backgrounds in communications, and we felt like art was a tool for communication, and that could be used for some marginalized group to really find and share their voice and connect with people through that. And so we had this idea, and we wanted to make sure that there was a need for that in the community, that it was some group of people who felt like that art could be used as this tool for communication and bringing people together. And so we settled on this idea of working with young people. And at that point in time, they were referred to as at-risk youth. We've thankfully gotten away from that terminology. But as much as confirming that there was a need for this by talking to people who worked with youth, we wanted to make sure that there was an openness to it too, because I think that's just as important. And we were aware of the racial dynamics. We didn't want to be white saviors, although I don't know that we would have called it that at that point. But we knew that we weren't bringing something from the outside into these communities and these young people's lives, and that we were really trying to help pull out what was already there and provide resources and access and opportunities. And so we talked and thought a lot about that. And we settled on this partner model for delivering our programs. So we would work with community centers and boys and girls clubs and eventually schools. And so really seeing ourselves as a collaborator and a complement to what these other organizations were doing in the lives of young people, and thinking that together we could leverage resources. They had the young people, they had the facilities, they had the social workers, they had relationships with the families and the space, and we had artists, and we could train them, and we could bring these quality programs and creative expression to what they were already doing in those spaces. And so that's what we set out to do. And it was mostly Black youth, vast majority. And our teaching artists, so we contracted and trained teaching artists of all different disciplines. And there was diversity. We were conscious of that, but it was mostly white teaching artists. And sometimes we would try to pair Black and white artists together, just to kind of model that for our young people. And our first board was very diverse. We had our president was a lesbian, and our vice president was a Black man. And we had one of our program partners was on the board, and he had grown up in Richmond in public housing. And we had the photographer from the Richmond Free Press, Regina Boone, whose family had started the Free Press. And interestingly, Regina is back on the board now, having been on that charter board. And we also had a gay man who had been on our original steering committee and later became our president. And we had a Latino, Diego Sanchez, who's probably been on the board of half of the arts organizations in Richmond, and is well known and well loved. And so having a diverse board, it was more interesting, and it felt more natural and more like the way the world is supposed to be. And so, we've done a decent job over the years, I think, of having diversity on the board, particularly racial diversity. And, I think we've been mindful of tokenism, because we did understand that, and we knew we didn't want to do that. And so really being thoughtful about why we were bringing people onto the board, and being clear about that there were specific reasons. It wasn't to meet some kind of a diversity goal or quota. And for us, diversity was really the priority was representation and relevant life experience, rather than diversity for diversity's sake, which I think is also important. But in our context, that really meant making sure we had Black folks on the board and on our staff. And so we thought about that with our recruitment, our board recruitment, and our hiring. And our first program staff was Angela Patton, who some of you may know as the founder of Camp Diva and the leader of Girls for Change. She was with us for 6 years. We've had a lot of rock stars on the Art 180 staff. So it's been great to see folks go off and really make their way and do huge things in the community. And so Angela had been one of our partners, and she brought not only her own life experience and professional experience, but she brought connections to all of these artists and really helped us diversify the teaching artists that we were sending into the programs. And race is important for the program staff and for those teaching artists, but we've also had Black staff in other roles, communications and development and administration, kind of all that. And I mean, I just want to point out that can't be the only consideration or really the sole criteria. I mean, we've had white program staff that were great at connecting to young people and their families. And we've had Black staff in those roles that people couldn't relate to. So I think we have to always consider the whole person and just realize our intentions behind why we're looking for a particular kind of person. Okay, so that kind of gives you the background. So I want to jump to more recent history where I feel like we've moved beyond diversity into equity. So picking it up in 2017, we had a Black board chair. He was chair for 3 years. He'd been on the board for 6 years prior to that. And we had a Black program director, Takia Glass, another rock star who was with us for 6 years. And we had a development/deputy director who was leaving. So I needed to think about replacing that key role. And that's when Nicole entered the scene. It's a new chapter. So Nicole was not new to Art 180. She was coming from our board and had been involved for a long time, originally as the parent of one of our participants. But she was new to fundraising. And, I'd like to say that hiring Nicole was about both diversity and equity, but I can't honestly say that it was either. I mean, at least not consciously. And it was really more about the type of person and the qualities that we needed, and knowing that the right person could grow into the role. And I remember being on vacation, sitting on the beach, going through the Rolodex in my mind and thinking about Nicole, and reaching out, texting her from the beach and to see if she wanted to have a conversation about this. And that's how we started on this journey. And I just felt like she was the right person at the right time and in the right stage in our relationship. So our leadership team at that point was Takia and Nicole and me, and we would meet weekly and we would have challenging conversations. And I think what was potentially more challenging were the things that weren't said, or the things that weren't said when all three of us were at the table. But we were starting to just crack open some things, and some things were starting to emerge. And then we started this partnership with Richmond Memorial Health Foundation. And I really feel like this partnership was a catalyst for our work around equity. And so they had something called the Hearts Grant Program, which a lot of y'all probably are familiar with, and maybe you've actually received, but it was Hearts, Health, Equity, and Arts. And so we were in the first cohort of that in 2019. And besides grant funding for a program related to health, arts, and equity, there was a lot of education. There were mandatory training sessions throughout the whole grant term. And that grant program doesn't exist anymore, unfortunately, but I really feel like it's left this legacy. I know for Art 180, like I said, I really feel like it kind of pushed us in this direction a little more wholeheartedly. And I hope that's true for other organizations and really for the community more broadly, that they were really trying to advance these concepts through. So as part of that, in June of 2019, they had an all-day racial equity workshop. It was led by Ebony Walden. It's fantastic. And so Takia attended, and when she came back, she shared workshop resources with Nicole and me. And one of those was this organizational equity assessment. And so we kind of looked at this tool and said, is this something we should try to do? And just weren't quite sure where to go with this. And then about the same time, we heard from one of our former participants who was away in college at this point, and he was asking about reparations. And he felt like we had used his artwork on a tablecloth is what it really kind of spurred this whole thinking for him. But just thinking about how participants in a program are asked to volunteer or choose to volunteer, and they support programming, they support fundraising, and then the organization gains from that. And so really kind of thinking about, should he be compensated in some way for that, or should others like him in the future be compensated? So, these conversations were just continuing to surface. And so we knew we had to face them. And so that's when we started working with VCIC, Virginia Center for Inclusive Communities. Again, some of y'all have probably worked with them or been familiar. They're kind of the go-to locally, at least in terms of a nonprofit doing this work. And so Jonathan Zur, the director, had reached out to us, again, connected to RMHF. We were a grantee. And so they were inviting grantees to apply for this RVA equity grant, which would include working with VCIC, which we started doing in spring of 2020, right as, the world shut down. And their process is based on this Annie Casey framework and definitions and all that. And so the framework, it's a 7-step process that I think is worth just sharing. So it's to identify the current state of DEI in your organization, and then to brainstorm barriers to equity, and to consider other sources of information like stakeholders and data and focus groups and interviews, and then to analyze that information and to identify strengths and gaps that you need to address, and then to determine the structure for developing priorities and plans, and then agreeing on those priorities, and then developing the work plans and the timelines and all that. And the lessons I feel like I learned from VCIC are that diversity and inclusion are outcomes, and equity is an outcome, but it's really more of a process. And the goal of DEI should be to create institutions and communities that are humanizing to all. I think that's an important way to think about it. And the definitions that they were using were that diversity is the presence of difference, so counting people, and inclusion is accepting and respecting and valuing diversity, so making sure people count. And then equity is the state, quality, or idea of being just, impartial, and fair. And I think a simpler way of saying that is just fair and equal while factoring in differences, or sometimes you see fairness and justice, but we see a lot of definitions of equity. And I think it's just getting clear on what you are trying to address. So in May, again, this is 2020, VCI interviewed all 8 of our employees at the time, these confidential one-on-one conversations, just to get their views and experiences related to equity. And the findings were that there was a consensus that Art 180 had made progress in increasing diversity and discussing equity, but there were widely varying understandings of what equity means and how it's applied to our work. And there was a lack of consensus on how high of a priority it was for the organization, especially in light of COVID and adapting to that. That there was a need for professional development, and some suggestions included reviewing our artist training, analyzing our communication and messaging, and formalizing hiring practices. And finally, that there was a desire for our work around equity to be formalized. So we're going through the summer working with them. And then there was this pivotal period in the fall of 2020. It was September. And so the start of our program year and our new board term, and Takia resigned after 6 years. And Sean O'Brien was elected board president. So here we've had a Black man in the role for 3 years and on the board for 9 years. And now we have a white man stepping into that role in September of 2020. And we had a Black female vice president at the time as well, because that representation and leadership felt important. So Sean knew in his role. He was aware of our internal conversations, our work with VCIC, the environment with the racial unrest and everything that we were addressing as a society. And so he decided to establish a racial equity task force. And he really wanted us to have this enhanced focus on equity at the highest level. And so we invited 8 board members, which was more than half at the time, and 3 staff. And so we had this 11-person task force. And so it was a serious commitment. We also invited that alum that I mentioned who had reached out and raised questions related to reparations, but he decided not to participate. So we got this task force and we decided to align that with VCIC's work. And so as a task force, we met monthly for 6 months. We had small group meetings. And one of the first things we did was we looked at barriers to equity, as I mentioned, that being a part of the process. And some of them that I think are worth sharing here in case you're thinking about going through this work, or you can imagine barriers in your own organizations or have gone through this work and can relate to this too. But some of the barriers were a lack of awareness or consciousness, or an understanding of what equity, true equity is. Ignorance or blinders to examples of inequity. It's hard to institutionalize and formalize this work, and making it an organizational priority can be challenging. It's difficult, or we have a lack of ability to measure equity. And then one that I thought was really interesting is the assumption that the diversity of the youth we serve and the teaching artists we hire meant that we're focused on equity as much as we could be. So out of that, we came up with these action steps and these tactics. There's a lot of talk around language. So shared understanding of equity and how it can be applied, and really how we talk about who we are and who we serve, and how we communicate that to different audiences. And also thinking around cultural competency in our programs, again, working with predominantly Black youth, that's important. And then the training of those teaching artists. So going through this process with VCIC was a really important exercise, and really kind of helped us prioritize and formalize and start to give some structure to our thinking and our intentionality around equity. But there were so many other things going on at the same time that were relevant, just sort of outside of this task force and this process. So we kind of went rogue and focused on those things, just set the plan aside a little bit, and did, while these other things already had momentum and were in the works. So things like our development committee was starting to shift to community-centric fundraising. And if you're not familiar with that, I encourage you to Google that and check it out. It's a movement to focus on the community first rather than donor-centered fundraising. And so it's really, for us, expanded to how we think about our whole organization, not just fundraising or our donors. But that's been an important shift, and that was already kind of a big thing we were moving toward. And then our finance committee formed an HR task force to look at compensation and benefits for staff. And this is really a carryover from our last strategic plan, which had pretty much stalled out like the week that everything shut down that March. And so this was something that they picked back up, and we started that task force, which was also a cross-section of board and staff. We also had a grant writer who was contracted, and we had discussions, particularly Nicole with her, around evolving our grant language, again, kind of how we talk about what we do and who we're serving. And that was happening simultaneously to AFP, the Association of Fundraising Professionals, starting this inclusive fundraising fellows program to diversify fundraising and bring people who are not just white folks into development. And so Nicole was in that first cohort, and she's now co-facilitating that program. We also revisited our values as an organization, and we added one that addressed equity. And also throughout this, we were working with Flora Kane, and I was talking to John Sarvey about organizational development. I think Serena's on here. I think Serena was there then. And through those conversations with John, just realized that the real need, or the priority, was for shared language and understanding. And so that led us to working with Josh Everson. And we initially focused on our personality. We're getting really clear on who we are and then developing these voice principles so that we could consistently talk about that through any platform. And then ultimately, as predicted, that led us to realize we needed to revisit our mission and our vision and our values. And so that's what we did with Josh. And for both of those processes, our entire staff was involved with Josh. And so it was a very collaborative process. Everybody had input, everybody had great suggestions. And so by consensus, we arrived at that new language. And throughout that, we shared that with the board and kind of got validation from them and input from them. And so that's just been a really huge process for all kinds of reasons, just cementing who we are and how we want to work together too as an organization. And I just really want to shout out Josh. And so if anybody is interested in talking more about that, I'm happy to have a conversation offline, because he really brought a lot of thoughtfulness to that process and made it what it became. We also revised our training for teaching artists, and in part to focus on that cultural competency. And we increased the stipend that we pay the teaching artists. We invited them to the second day of our staff retreat, because there was a lot of communication and miscommunication, frankly, between them and our program staff. And so just inviting them literally to the table to talk directly with them and hear their input. We've also started being more conscientious about paying artists for their time outside of leading programs when we ask them to do things, and also thinking about paying the young people, both for doing things that previously they might have done as a volunteer, but also starting to pay them for participation in programs as they're taking their participation more seriously, and us wanting to invest in that. And so this HR task force I mentioned was looking at compensation. And so a big thing that we did was this compensation review. And we outsourced for this. We hired Fahrenheit advisors, and they looked at market pricing and analysis of that and pay structures. And then they looked at our demographic statistics, looking at age and race and gender to make sure there wasn't anything showing up there that didn't feel right. And overall, what we learned from them and from that study is that base salaries were below market rate. They except for the one new position that we had started. And so we knew that a salary structure should promote internal equity and external competitiveness. And so we established salary ranges, and the placement on the range depends on experience and education and skill mastery and tenure and performance. But our compensation philosophy is to target the 50th percentile. So really the market median for pay. And so we did that. Our board committed to that. And in the next year, the next budget cycle, we had some significant pay increases for some of our employees to really bring those up to that 50th percentile. So making that commitment there. And then in our hiring, we now include pay ranges for transparency. And we also, in our job postings, now include a DEI statement and language around our values and that community-centric focus. Okay, I'm going to see if my coffee cooled off. Okay, so back to that pivotal point, fall of 2020. So following Takia's departure, we had 2 program managers. And so I asked the one that had more seniority if he would be the acting program director until we figured out what we wanted to do with that role. And then about a month later, in October, Nicole became our deputy director. And so she became much more involved in decision-making and much bigger influencer. And so one of the first things that we talked about was that decision and what the permanent decision would be. And so she helped me to look at both Vaughn and Maurice as equal contenders for different reasons. So really thinking about this balance of both education and directly relevant experience with a different kind of involvement. Maurice had not been on staff very long, but he had been a teaching artist for many years at that point, and life experience and indirectly relevant experience. So again, really trying to think about the whole person. And so we made the decision that they would be co-directors going forward. And so for 2.5 years, that's what we did. And the 4 of us were the leadership team. And I mentioned Vaughn left in June after 5 years. So we now have a Black board president, female. We have all female board officers, 2 Black and 2 white. Our board is 2/3 Black. We have an alum on the board. It's not the person I mentioned, but it is someone who was involved for a long time. Our staff is 4 white and 4 Black, plus the intern that I mentioned. And maybe not surprisingly, our Black staff are working with programs and primarily, and our white staff in operations. Nicole is in both. But I think it's not accidental, but it's not entirely intentional either, but I think it's completely appropriate. So we have a Black program director. I mentioned Mo. He's here part of the time and doing this work from Berlin part of the time. And so our staff leadership team is the 3 of us. So it's Marlene, Nicole, Maurice, Eminem. And then one of our team members, Mecca, her title was Outreach and Engagement Manager. And so we changed that to be Manager of Cultural Awareness and Engagement. Again, to really prioritize and make sure we were thinking about cultural relevancy in our work. And then the way we talk about ourselves now as part of that work with Josh is as a collective. And so we make a lot of decisions collaboratively, either as Nicole, Mo, and me, or as a full team, but also thinking beyond the staff to the board and the teaching artist and the young people and our donors and kind of everybody who's in the ecosystem as this collective, because everybody's bringing different things. And it's only if we recognize that and acknowledge that we can really have this truly diverse and broad-ranging collective. I am also in a racial affinity group. And if you don't know what that is, it's just people of the same race getting together to talk about race explicitly. And so since almost the beginning of COVID, I've been in this small group there are now 4 of us, all white women working in nonprofits. And so it's a chance for us monthly to just have really honest conversations about challenges, ways we can grow, how we can learn from each other again, and how to give each other feedback and perspective. And it's just been a real support group and really pushing us in our growth in this area. And so I think of equity as a journey, not a destination, and it's certainly ongoing work. I wanted to share something. I'm on an email list for an organization called the Ross Collective, and they focus on strategic planning with a DEI emphasis. And so Renee Ross compares equity to diversity. She says that diversity is the presence of differences within a given setting. But once people with diverse identities join historically white-led boards, what happens? The board must have courageous conversations about privilege and the ways in which the culture of these organizations give more power to people with privilege. And as part of this, Sean, our board president for the last 3 years, and I met with board members individually, kind of following that work of those task forces and really just wanting to have more intimate individual conversations where we could talk about this and make sure everybody understood and was committed to being an anti-racist organization. So Ross also says equity is about power shifting, and they define equity as people who are closest to the problems are weighing in on the solutions, and systems are shifted so that people who have been outside of power have access to power. And then finally, I just want to acknowledge Nicole's role in this, which I alluded to in the beginning, but I've told her she is the ebony to my ivory, and I will spare you singing that song, which I've been known to do, but that means something to me. She's been an important advisor and co-leader, and more importantly, she's widened our perspective to center the community that we serve. And she's also connected us to RPS more deeply and to restorative justice and healing-centered engagement practices. And, I could have read all the textbooks and articles and listened to the podcasts ever published about equity. And there's just no greater education than being able to work with someone who can both represent and lead. And so I've been really lucky, and Art 180 has benefited from that. She's coming up on 6 years. So that's the more than 30 minutes I wanted to share with you. I'm happy to take questions, but again, I'd love for folks to feel comfortable sharing their own examples, because there's a lot more that I know we could all learn from. Questions, thoughts, things you've tried, things you want to try. Questions for Nicole since she's on the call.
Marlene, thank you very much for sharing your experience. You've done some tremendous work, it seems, some really introspective work. From your request of sharing some examples, I won't tell our 45 minutes and more journey, but a couple of things that we've been doing recently, I'll share. We took a hard look at our grants program and what were the barriers there, and we've seen tremendously increased participation in our grants program from BIPOC artists and organizations primarily serving BIPOC and other underrepresented communities. But we've also been looking at our own organization. Catherine and a consultant, Angela Hayes, led a series of what we call in-depth interviews, similar to some of the assessments. I think that I was thinking about the assessments you were talking about, where we heard the feedback from particularly artists of color and leaders of color of nonprofit artists organizations, and from that learned some things that we need to work on, and also have formed a new committee. We're calling it our Cultural Equity Committee, which is made up of Black leaders and artists to help us be an advisory committee to help with those leadership decisions, to supplement what our board is already doing and what we're doing as a staff. So that's just a few examples of some things that we're doing in that space as well. But thank you again for sharing your journey. That was terrific.
And I mentioned our new program manager, Dallas Roquemore, who I learned received one of those artist grants during COVID. So when we were talking about this, he's like, CultureWorks, I know them, got a grant.
Glad to do it.
Emily, I see your hand raised. You're on mute.
Good morning. Thank you all for allowing me to be in this and to hear what you're doing about equity. And I appreciate CultureWorks because I received one of those grants to do the You and Me Too project and collaborated with another artist to do it. I'm a poet, but I collaborated with her and received the grant, and I felt included as a poet in what you all are doing to just include everybody. I just thought it was automatic, you're just doing it without effort, it seemed to me. But I'd like to just encourage you, just say it seems that your efforts are working, and I appreciated the information, learning about how the speaker is incorporating equity in her movement, and also hearing from Scott and how CultureWorks is about equity. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that, Emily. Good to see you.
Thank you.
Scott, has that Cultural Equity Committee, is that already underway?
Yeah, we had 3 monthly meetings, and now we're moving to quarterly meetings. Yeah.
Who is on that? Can you share?
Do we have permission from the members to share, Catherine? So we have Anjali Moon, we have Kendra Jones from Richmond Memorial Health Foundation, who led that Hearts program you're talking about.
Yeah.
We have Greg Gallup from the Community Foundation, who manages the arts portfolio over there and is a filmmaker himself.
Yeah.
And then we have, oh, I'm drawing a blank on, we have the gentleman from the American Civil War Museum, Oliver, is that right, Catherine? And I'm missing one. Who am I missing, Catherine?
Brian from the Petersburg.
Oh, right. Yeah, Brian from Petersburg Symphony.
Cool. That's great.
Are there any more questions or comments from anyone?
I will add, Marlene, I know we have a limited audience here today, but I think we do see we record these and we see a lot of folks come back to it. I hope a number of organizations do come and take a look at this, because I get the question a lot from organizations with primarily whiteboards saying we want to diversify. How do we diversify? And so I love the change. Well, I guess you started with an intentionally diverse board way back in the day when you first started, but I think some of what you describe is a great way to build, and it's important to build those boards that represent the communities that we serve. So hopefully this will help others in that journey.
I think that's important for all of us, of course, all boards. I think for organizations like Art 180 that are serving predominantly Black youth or brown youth or whatever, it's critically important. So, you know, we need to take that even more seriously and make sure that we're thinking about it all the time. But yeah, it's something that that all boards need to do.
Agreed.
Okay, well, if there are no more questions or comments, we will end a little bit early. Thank you for joining us. Marlene, thank you for being our speaker this month. This was really great, and I've taken a lot of notes and may circle back to you individually as I continue to do my work. I am looking to book speakers for 2024 coffee hour. So if you'd like to present on a topic, please email me. I also do our quarterly newsletter and have been trying to make sure that the information in that is more culturally diverse. And Piper does spotlights, and we've also been making an effort to highlight more BIPOC artists and organizations in our spotlights and our social media. So you can contact her if you'd like to do one of those. Again, thank you for joining us, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine and Piper. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Marlene.
Yeah, sure thing.
Bye, everyone. Good to see everyone.
Thank you.